In this video, I'm going to briefly run through a question that I found, a similar type of question to what I found in Jeffrey Perloff's microeconomics textbook. The way they asked the question was a little confusing, so I'm going to try to translate the question a little bit. But it's also an interesting question just to discuss about how we can use microeconomic principles to try to answer an interesting question. So here's the setup. What we want to do is try to figure out how supply shocks might affect the price of oil in the world oil market, and at the same time as a supply shock is going on, basically meaning that something disrupts the supply of oil. It could be just as easy as Saudi Arabia deciding to cut back on their production, since they're one of the main producers of oil in the world. So suppose they just decide to cut back by 10 million barrels of oil. What effect will that have on the price of oil? The second question is there anything that the United States or any other country could do to try to ameliorate the price increases, to try to keep those price increases from being so high? And in the textbook question, they say, well, what if we at the same time opened up ANWR, which is the Alaskan National Wildlife Refuge, for drilling for oil, and we could get, say, 1 million barrels of that back. How much could we keep the price from going up by doing that? Okay. Before we get going, let me show you what ANWR is, just in case you haven't seen it. I know a lot of people have heard of it, but here's the state of Alaska, which is huge compared to the rest of the United States. So here's Alaska. Now let me just move that up here. Here's Alaska, and you can see how large that is compared to the continental U.S. It's not quite as big, but it would take up a huge chunk of it. Now let's look at ANWR real quickly, the Wildlife Refuge. It's up here in the northeast corner of Alaska. So over here is Canada, but this green part over here to the border of Canada, this is ANWR. Sorry, not Alaskan, but the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I got the acronym incorrect. In addition to ANWR, there's some other national park lands over here and over here and over here in Alaska. So a lot of the land in Alaska is either national forest or a wildlife refuge. But they suspect that there might be a lot of oil in this region, in this one, in ANWR. So that being said, how do we answer this kind of question? Well, suppose the demand curve for oil is something like 100 minus 0.5p, and the supply is 20 plus 0.6p. First, suppose Saudi Arabia decided to cut back the supply on 10 million barrels of oil. The question we'd want to know is, how much would the price of oil rise just with this change? Before we answer that, we need to know what the equilibrium price and quantity are for oil before any changes, right? So what's our starting point? So if we just set this equal to this, the supply equation equal to the demand equation, then what you'll get is an equilibrium price here of, so what we would get when we solve that is an equilibrium price of $72.73. Now, how much would the price of oil rise without us drilling in ANWR? Well, what we do now, or the easiest way to think about Saudi Arabia cutting back by 10 million barrels of oil, is just to say, well, if this is the supply function, which tells us the quantity, then let's just cut 10 out of this equation. And so instead of Q equals 20 plus 0.6p, we just subtract 10 from the starting point there, and that's going to be a leftward shift of the supply curve by 10. So what we would end up with is solving the equations 100 minus 0.5p equals 10 plus 0.6p. And 10 plus 0.6p Too many typos. Sorry about that. And if you solve those two equations, you'll get an equilibrium price after the supply shock of $81.82. Well, it's actually 81.818181 repeating. And now let's answer the final question. How much if we, at the same time, simultaneously, at the same time that Saudi Arabia is cutting back by 10 million barrels of oil, what if we could be opening up ANWR and increasing the supply by 1 million barrels of oil? So what we would be doing here is solving these two equations. Instead of subtracting 10, we subtract 10 and then we add 1 back. This coming from ANWR. So, I apologize for coughing. So what we would end up with is solving those two equations, and you'd end up with an equilibrium price of P equals $80.91. $80.91. So, how plausible is any of this? Well, we don't know how much oil would be coming from ANWR. And we also, it would be hard, in the real world, to say that we're going to simultaneously be able to increase production from an untapped area where we'd have to explore. It would take some time. On the other hand, it is clear that in the long run, that if we did explore for oil there and found oil, that would increase the supply. And when you increase the supply of oil, it's going to eventually bring the prices down. So I'm not going to get into the political debate, but we can use economics to try to inform the political debate about whether we should or should not drill in ANWR. So I'm going to end this here. Just thought it was an interesting example to go through. As always, if you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Otherwise, this is Berkey Academy saying goodbye for now.